What if everything you've been told about the Knights Templar is a carefully constructed lie? What if their origins don't trace back to the Crusades of 1119, but stretch much deeper into history, reaching all the way back to King Solomon himself? You're standing at the edge of a mystery that has been deliberately obscured for nearly 1,000 years. A mystery that connects the wisest king who ever lived to the most powerful military order in medieval Europe. And if the evidence is true, it suggests that the Templars weren't just warrior monks protecting pilgrims. They were the guardians of ancient secrets that predate Christianity itself. This isn't just another conspiracy theory. This is a trail of evidence hidden in plain sight, scattered across centuries of documents, symbols, and rituals that powerful institutions have worked tirelessly to suppress. Because if the truth about the Templars' real origins ever came to light, it would rewrite everything we understand about the relationship between faith, power, and ancient wisdom. You feel that familiar tingle when you're about to uncover something forbidden, the kind of knowledge that makes institutions nervous and historians uncomfortable. Because this story doesn't just challenge what we know about the Templars, it challenges the very foundations of how we understand the development of Western civilization. Picture yourself in the Jerusalem of 970 BCE. King Solomon sits upon his throne, not just as a political ruler, but as a keeper of cosmic wisdom. The biblical accounts tell us he was granted divine knowledge that surpassed all the kings of the earth. But what they don't tell us is what he did with that knowledge, or more importantly, how he ensured it would survive the ages. The traditional story of Solomon speaks of his wisdom in governing, his wealth, and his magnificent temple. But beneath these surface narratives lies something far more intriguing. Evidence that Solomon wasn't just wise, he was the inheritor and guardian of mystery traditions that reached back to the dawn of civilization. Ancient Jewish texts outside the biblical canon speak of Solomon's mastery over supernatural forces. The Testament of Solomon describes his ability to command demons and spirits through the power of a magical ring given to him by the archangel Michael. The Key of Solomon, a medieval grimoire, claims to preserve his secret magical practices. These weren't just folklore. They were fragments of a systematic body of knowledge that Solomon had systematically organized and preserved. But here's where the story takes a turn that should make you pause. Solomon didn't keep this knowledge to himself. According to hidden traditions that have survived in fragmentary form through various esoteric orders, he established a secret brotherhood tasked with preserving and protecting these ancient mysteries for future generations. You begin to see the implications. If such a brotherhood existed, if it somehow survived the destruction of the First Temple in 586 BCE, if it managed to preserve Solomon's secrets through centuries of conquest and exile, then the sudden appearance of the Knights Templar in 1119 takes on an entirely different significance. Because here's what mainstream history doesn't want you to consider. The official founding story of the Knights Templar has gaps that historians have never adequately explained. 9 knights, led by Hugh de Payens, supposedly approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a request to protect Christian pilgrims on the dangerous roads to the Holy Land. The king granted them quarters in his palace, which was built on the site of Solomon's temple.
But here's the problem with this official narrative. For the first 9 years of their existence, there's virtually no record of the Templars actually protecting pilgrims. Instead, Contemporary accounts suggest they spent most of their time conducting excavations beneath the Temple Mount, searching for something specific in the ruins of Solomon's original structure. What were they looking for? The official answer is that they were seeking religious relics, perhaps the Ark of the Covenant or fragments of the True Cross. But the evidence suggests they were searching for something far more specific: the hidden repositories where Solomon's secret order had concealed their most precious treasures before the Babylonian conquest. And according to whispered traditions that have survived in various forms throughout history, they found exactly what they were looking for. You feel the weight of this revelation settling in your mind, because if the Templars discovered Solomon's hidden archives, if they gained access to the wisdom traditions that had been preserved in secret for over 1,000 years, then their subsequent rise to power across Europe wasn't just political or military success. It was the result of possessing knowledge that gave them advantages no one else could match. This would explain the mysteries that have always surrounded the Templars: their incredible wealth, their influence over European royalty, their sophisticated banking systems, their architectural innovations, their mysterious rituals and initiations. All of these could be explained if they had access to Solomon's accumulated wisdom about governance, finance, engineering, and the manipulation of human psychology. But it also explains something else that historians have struggled to understand: the specific accusations made against the Templars when they were finally suppressed in 1307. They weren't just charged with heresy in general terms. They were accused of worshiping a mysterious head called Baphomet, of practicing secret initiation rites, of possessing forbidden knowledge that threatened Christian orthodoxy. These accusations make perfect sense if the Templars had indeed inherited Solomon's mystery traditions, because Solomon's wisdom wasn't just practical, it was fundamentally esoteric, involving practices and perspectives that would be considered deeply heretical by medieval Christian standards. The connection becomes even clearer when you examine the symbols and imagery associated with both Solomon and the Templars. The six-pointed star, known as the Seal of Solomon, appears throughout Templar iconography, often in conjunction with their famous red cross. The temple motif that dominates Masonic tradition, which many believe inherited Templar traditions, explicitly traces its origins back to Solomon's temple.
Even more intriguingly, the geometric principles that governed the construction of Solomon's temple, according to biblical descriptions, match the sacred geometry that appears in Templar churches and preceptories across Europe. This wasn't coincidence. It was the preservation and application of architectural knowledge that had been passed down through an unbroken chain of initiated guardians. You start to understand why this knowledge had to be kept secret. Solomon's wisdom traditions drew from sources that predated Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They incorporated elements from Egyptian mystery schools, Babylonian astronomical knowledge, and Persian magical practices. A medieval Christian order that openly acknowledged these influences would have been branded heretical from the moment of its founding. So instead, they adopted a cover story. They presented themselves as simple warrior monks dedicated to protecting Christian pilgrims. They allowed the world to believe they were just another religious military order like the Hospitallers or the Teutonic Knights. And while the world watched their public facade, they quietly reconstructed the ancient mystery tradition that Solomon had established nearly 2 millennia earlier. This secret tradition explains why the Templars developed their own unique initiation rites, why they required absolute secrecy from their members, why they operated according to principles that often seemed to contradict standard Christian doctrine. They weren't just following the rule of Saint Benedict or any other Christian monastic tradition. They were following the much older and more complex traditions that Solomon had codified in his secret order. The implications of this are staggering.
If the Templars were indeed the inheritors of Solomon's mystery tradition, then their suppression in 1307 wasn't just the destruction of a military order, it was the attempted destruction of a wisdom tradition that had survived for over 2,000 years, preserving knowledge that the Catholic Church found too dangerous to allow. But here's the most unsettling part of this revelation. According to multiple independent sources, the attempt at destruction failed. The Templar leadership, warned in advance of the coming arrests, managed to evacuate their most precious treasures and documents before the raids began. These materials disappeared completely from the historical record, along with a significant number of Templars who were never captured. Where did they go? What happened to Solomon's accumulated wisdom? Did the secret order that began with the wisest king in history simply vanish? Or did it continue to operate in new forms, under new names, preserving its ancient mission for future generations? As we'll discover in the next chapter, the evidence suggests that Solomon's secret order didn't just survive the Templar suppression, it had been preparing for exactly such an eventuality for centuries. Because when you're the guardian of wisdom that spans millennia, you learn to think in terms of much longer timescales than any single political or religious authority.
You're standing in the inner sanctum of Solomon's Temple in 950 BCE, surrounded by walls that shimmer with gold and precious stones. But your eyes aren't drawn to the obvious wealth. Instead, you're captivated by the intricate geometric patterns carved into every surface, mathematical relationships that seem to pulse with hidden meaning. This isn't just architecture, it's a three-dimensional textbook encoding knowledge that would take lifetimes to fully comprehend. The biblical account tells us that Solomon's temple was magnificent, but it barely hints at the true purpose of this extraordinary structure. Because according to traditions preserved in fragmentary texts and whispered through esoteric circles for millennia, the temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was the ancient world's most sophisticated repository of hidden knowledge, a crystallized university where the accumulated wisdom of ages was preserved in stone, metal, and sacred geometry. The dimensions given in the biblical description aren't arbitrary. The temple's proportions follow mathematical principles that appear in nature's most fundamental patterns: the golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, harmonic frequencies that resonate with human consciousness itself. Every measurement was calculated to create specific effects on those who entered, designed to induce altered states of awareness that would make the mind more receptive to higher knowledge. But the temple's physical structure was just the outer shell of something far more complex. According to texts like the Testament of Solomon and various Kabbalistic writings, the real treasures lay hidden in chambers that don't appear in any public architectural plans. These secret repositories contained artifacts and documents that Solomon had gathered from across the known world. The accumulated wisdom of Egyptian mystery schools, Babylonian astronomical texts, Persian magical practices, and knowledge traditions that reached back to the very dawn of human civilization. You begin to understand that Solomon wasn't just wise in the conventional sense. He was a systematic collector and synthesizer of ancient knowledge, someone who understood that civilization was cyclical and that precious wisdom could be lost if not carefully preserved. The temple was his insurance policy against the dark ages he knew would inevitably come. The Ark of the Covenant, the most famous treasure supposedly housed in the temple, takes on new significance in this context. Traditional accounts describe it as a container for the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, but earlier sources suggest something far more complex, a sophisticated device incorporating advanced metallurgy and possibly electromagnetic principles, designed not just to store sacred objects, but to serve as a focal point for consciousness-altering practices. Ancient descriptions of the ark's effects on those who touched it improperly, instant death or severe illness, suggest it may have been some kind of advanced technology that modern science is only beginning to understand. The detailed instructions for its construction given in Exodus, with their precise specifications for metals, dimensions, and positioning, read less like religious ritual and more like technical blueprints. But the Ark was just one element in a much larger system. The temple's design incorporated acoustic principles that modern sound engineers recognize as sophisticated resonance chambers. The precise placement of pillars, the dimensions of the inner sanctuary, even the materials used in construction, everything was calculated to create specific sound frequencies that could induce transcendent states of consciousness.
This wasn't accidental. Solomon had inherited knowledge from traditions that understood the relationship between sound, geometry, and human awareness. The same principles that govern the construction of the Egyptian pyramids, the stone circles of Britain, and other ancient sacred sites around the world. These structures weren't just monuments, they were functional technologies designed to facilitate expanded consciousness and direct communion with cosmic forces. The two famous pillars at the temple's entrance, Jachin and Boaz, weren't merely decorative. According to Masonic tradition, which claims to preserve authentic Solomonic knowledge, these pillars represented fundamental principles of existence: stability and change, masculine and feminine, light and darkness. But they were also functional elements in the temple's consciousness-altering technology, precisely positioned to create standing wave patterns that would affect anyone passing between them. You feel a chill as you realize the implications. If the temple was indeed a sophisticated consciousness laboratory, then Solomon's wisdom wasn't just philosophical or practical, it was technological. He possessed knowledge about the deepest workings of human consciousness that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. This explains why so many later traditions trace their origins back to Solomon. Not just because he was wise in the conventional sense, but because he had systematized and preserved practical techniques for expanding human awareness and capability. The temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was a training facility where initiated students could learn to access higher states of consciousness and develop capabilities that would seem miraculous to ordinary perception. The knowledge preserved in the temple extended far beyond consciousness manipulation. Ancient sources describe vast libraries containing astronomical observations spanning thousands of years, mathematical principles that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance, metallurgical techniques that produced materials of impossible strength and purity, and medical knowledge that could heal conditions still considered incurable today. But perhaps most importantly, the temple archives contain detailed records of human history that contradicted every official narrative. According to these hidden traditions, Solomon had access to chronicles that revealed the true origins of human civilization, the real relationship between earthly and cosmic forces, and the cyclical nature of human development across vast spans of time. This knowledge was systematically organized according to principles that modern information theorists would recognize as sophisticated data storage and retrieval systems. Each piece of information was encoded multiple ways: through symbols, through architectural proportions, through ritual actions, through sacred texts that could be read on multiple levels depending on the reader's level of initiation. The secret order that Solomon established to guard this knowledge wasn't just a group of priest scholars. It was a carefully structured organization designed to ensure the survival and transmission of the temple's treasures across generations and civilizations. Members were initiated gradually into deeper levels of understanding, each level protected by oaths that guaranteed the knowledge would never be carelessly revealed or misused.
The order's members were placed throughout the ancient world, establishing hidden centers of learning in Egypt, Babylon, Persia, and other major civilizations. They worked quietly to influence the development of human knowledge, seeding discoveries and innovations at precisely the right moments to advance human development without triggering destructive reactions from political or religious authorities. When the Babylonians finally conquered Jerusalem in 586 BCE, the Secret Order was ready. They had spent decades preparing for this eventuality, carefully evacuating the temple's most precious treasures and relocating them to secure repositories across the Mediterranean world. The physical temple was destroyed, but its essential knowledge survived in the hands of Solomon's hidden guardians. For over 1,000 years, this knowledge remained scattered and hidden, preserved by various groups that maintained the traditions Solomon had established. Gnostic schools in Alexandria, mystery cults in Greece and Rome, esoteric Jewish communities scattered throughout the diaspora all maintained fragments of the original Solomonic wisdom while waiting for the right moment to reconstitute the complete tradition. That moment came with the Crusades. When Christian armies conquered Jerusalem in 1099, they unknowingly created the perfect opportunity for Solomon's hidden order to reclaim their ancient headquarters. The presence of Christian military orders provided the ideal cover for conducting the excavations necessary to recover whatever treasures might have remained hidden beneath the Temple Mount. The 9 knights who established themselves on the Temple Mount in 1119 weren't random warriors seeking to protect pilgrims. They were carefully selected initiates of Solomon's secret order, men who had been prepared for exactly this mission through lifetimes of study and preparation. Their excavations weren't exploratory, they were retrieval operations guided by detailed maps and descriptions that had been preserved for over a millennium. What they found beneath the ruined foundations exceeded even their expectations. Not just the artifacts and documents that had been hidden during the Babylonian siege, but evidence of much older repositories that Solomon himself had discovered and incorporated into his temple complex. Knowledge that stretched back to the very beginnings of human civilization, preserved in forms that had survived flood, fire, and the rise and fall of empires. The transformation of these 9 knights into the most powerful military order in Europe wasn't the result of political maneuvering or military prowess. It was the inevitable consequence of possessing knowledge that gave them advantages no earthly power could match. They understood principles of organization, finance, psychology, and technology that wouldn't be rediscovered by the rest of humanity for centuries. As we'll explore in the next chapter, the Templars' subsequent actions make perfect sense when viewed as the systematic reconstruction of Solomon's original order on a European scale. Every innovation they introduced, every ritual they practiced, every symbol they adopted can be traced back to the ancient knowledge they had recovered from beneath the Temple Mount.
You're crouched in a torch-lit tunnel beneath the Temple Mount in 1120, watching as 9 men work with the precision of engineers who know exactly what they're looking for. The official records will claim these Knights Templar spent their first years protecting Christian pilgrims, but you're witnessing something far different. This is a carefully planned archaeological operation guided by maps and measurements that have been preserved for over 1,000 years. Udipans runs his fingers along carved stones that bear symbols no crusader should recognize, geometric patterns that match descriptions in ancient texts his order has secretly maintained since before Christ's birth. This isn't random exploration. These men are following a treasure map written in stone and parchment, leading them to repositories that Solomon's secret order sealed away during the Babylonian conquest. The transformation that followed their discoveries would reshape the balance of power across medieval Europe. But to understand how 9 relatively unknown knights became the most influential military order in Christendom, you need to see what they found in those hidden chambers beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple. The first chamber they breached contained exactly what their ancient maps had promised: sealed vessels containing scrolls wrapped in oiled leather, their text still legible after 15 centuries underground. These weren't just religious documents or historical records.
They were technical manuals describing principles of organization, finance, psychology, and governance that wouldn't be rediscovered by mainstream European thought for another 300 years. Among the scrolls were detailed architectural plans, not just for Solomon's temple, but for a network of sacred structures that had once spanned the ancient world. Each building was designed according to precise mathematical principles that created specific effects on human consciousness. The Templars now possessed blueprints for constructing buildings that could serve as schools for expanded awareness, training centers for developing capabilities that ordinary people would consider supernatural. But the most shocking discovery lay deeper, in chambers that had been sealed not during the Babylonian conquest, but during Solomon's own reign. Here they found artifacts that challenged everything they thought they knew about the limits of ancient technology. Devices constructed from materials that shouldn't have existed in the ancient world, incorporating principles of metallurgy and engineering that European science wouldn't understand for centuries. The objects defied easy categorization. Some appeared to be instruments for astronomical observation, but with capabilities far beyond any known ancient device. Others seemed designed for medical purposes, incorporating knowledge of human anatomy and physiology that medieval medicine couldn't match. Most mysterious of all were devices that seemed to respond to human consciousness itself, activating when handled by individuals who had undergone specific mental training. You watch as Depiens carefully examines what appears to be a crystalline structure embedded with metallic components arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. When he places his hands on specific contact points, the device begins to emit a low harmonic tone that resonates through the chamber walls. The other knights step back instinctively, recognizing that they're in the presence of technology that transcends their understanding. The scrolls provided context for these discoveries. Solomon had inherited much of this knowledge from even older traditions, Egyptian and Mesopotamian mystery schools that traced their origins back to the dawn of recorded history. But he had done something unprecedented. Systematically organized and tested these ancient teachings, creating the first scientific approach to what later ages would dismiss as magic or superstition.
The secret order Solomon established wasn't just a religious brotherhood. It was a research institution dedicated to understanding and developing human potential, according to principles that mainstream civilization wasn't ready to accept. The knowledge they preserved covered every aspect of human development, from basic survival skills to advanced consciousness manipulation, from practical engineering to cosmic philosophy. As the Templars continued their excavations, they uncovered evidence of the sophisticated network Solomon's order had maintained throughout the ancient world. Hidden chambers contained correspondence with affiliated groups in Egypt, Babylon, Persia, and even distant lands that wouldn't appear on European maps for centuries. This wasn't just local knowledge, it was part of a global tradition that had somehow survived the rise and fall of empires. The implications were staggering. If Solomon's order had maintained active connections across the known world, if they had preserved advanced knowledge through the collapse of classical civilization, then the Knights Templar weren't just recovering ancient relics. They were reconnecting with a tradition that had never actually died, only gone underground during the Dark Ages that followed Rome's fall. This explains the speed and sophistication of the Templars' subsequent expansion across Europe. They weren't building a new organization from scratch. They were implementing organizational principles that had been tested and refined over millennia. Every aspect of their structure, from their initiation rituals to their financial systems, followed patterns described in the ancient texts they had recovered. The banking innovations that made the Templars legendary weren't medieval inventions. They were applications of economic principles that Solomon's order had developed and used throughout the ancient world.
the ability to transfer funds across vast distances, to maintain accurate records of complex transactions, to manage risk across multiple ventures. All of these capabilities were described in scrolls that predated European banking by over 1,000 years. Their military prowess wasn't just a result of training and discipline. The ancient texts included detailed studies of psychology and group dynamics, describing how to maintain morale under extreme conditions, how to coordinate complex operations across vast distances, how to inspire absolute loyalty in subordinates. The Templars were applying principles of leadership and organization that had been systematically developed and tested across centuries of application. But perhaps most significantly, they had recovered the initiation procedures that Solomon's order had used to identify and develop individuals with exceptional capabilities. Not everyone was suitable for the advanced training that unlocked higher human potential. The ancient texts described precise methods for recognizing those who possessed the necessary psychological and physiological characteristics, and systematic approaches for developing their latent abilities. This explains the Templars' reputation for secrecy and their mysterious initiation rituals. They weren't just swearing members to conventional religious vows, they were implementing a sophisticated screening and training process designed to identify individuals capable of handling advanced knowledge responsibly. Only those who demonstrated the necessary psychological and ethical development were admitted to the inner circles where the real secrets were preserved.
Even their choice of the Temple Mount as headquarters wasn't just convenient real estate. According to the texts they recovered, certain geographical locations possessed natural properties that enhanced the effects of consciousness-altering practices. Solomon's temple had been built on one of these natural power spots, and its ruins still retained enough residual energy to serve as a training center for advanced practitioners. As word of the Templars' capabilities spread throughout Europe, they began attracting members who weren't just seeking military adventure or religious salvation. Sons of noble families who had preserved fragments of ancient traditions in their bloodlines, scholars who had maintained connections to esoteric knowledge through Muslim and Jewish sources, craftsmen who had inherited practical applications of sacred geometry through guild traditions, all found their way to the expanding Templar organization. This influx of knowledge from multiple sources allowed the Templars to reconstruct much more of Solomon's original system than they could have from the Temple Mount discoveries alone. Each new initiate brought pieces of the puzzle that had been preserved through different lineages, allowing the order to rebuild the complete structure of ancient wisdom that had been scattered during the fall of classical civilization. But this reconstruction process also revealed something that should have terrified them. The ancient texts contained prophecies and warnings about the cyclical nature of human development, predictions about recurring dark ages when advanced knowledge would have to be hidden to prevent its misuse. According to these sources, they were living during one of these dangerous transition periods, when the expansion of human capability would inevitably trigger violent reactions from established authorities. Solomon's order had survived previous suppressions by developing sophisticated strategies for preserving knowledge through periods of persecution. The Templars now found themselves inheritors not just of ancient wisdom, but of equally ancient strategies for protecting that wisdom from those who would destroy it rather than allow it to challenge their power. As we'll discover in the next chapter, these warnings proved prophetic. The very success of the Templars in applying Solomon's knowledge would eventually trigger the persecution that their ancient texts had predicted, forcing them to implement survival strategies that had been developed over 2 millennia of experience with suppression and renewal. The symbols and imagery that became associated with the Templars weren't arbitrary choices.
Every element of their iconography traced back to the ancient tradition they had inherited. The red cross wasn't just a Christian symbol, it encoded geometric relationships that appeared throughout Solomon's architectural designs. The famous Templar seal showing two knights riding a single horse wasn't just about poverty. It represented the dual nature of consciousness that was central to Solomon's teaching methods.
You're sitting in a candlelit chamber beneath the Templar preceptory in 1150, watching as a carefully selected initiate undergoes the final stages of a ceremony that traces its origins back 3,000 years. The ritual isn't Christian in any conventional sense, though it incorporates Christian symbolism as a protective shell. Beneath the familiar prayers and crosses lies something far older, a systematic method for awakening human consciousness that Solomon perfected and his secret order has preserved through the rise and fall of civilizations. The initiate doesn't know it yet, but he's about to become part of a tradition that transcends every religious and cultural boundary humanity has ever created. Solomon's secret order wasn't Jewish, Christian, or Islamic. It was something deeper, a brotherhood dedicated to preserving and developing the essential knowledge that all authentic spiritual traditions have glimpsed, but none have fully preserved. This is the secret that the Templars discovered in those buried chambers, not just ancient artifacts or forgotten texts, but the organizational structure of humanity's first and most successful mystery school. Solomon hadn't just been wise, he had been the architect of a system for preserving and transmitting advanced knowledge that could survive any external catastrophe. The foundation of Solomon's order rested on a revolutionary insight. Consciousness itself follows natural laws that can be studied, understood, and systematically developed. Just as the human body grows according to predictable biological patterns, human awareness expands according to psychological and spiritual principles that remain constant across cultures and centuries. But unlike physical development, consciousness expansion requires careful guidance and protection. Uncontrolled awakening can lead to madness, grandiosity, or the kind of spiritual inflation that produces tyrants and false messiahs. Solomon's order had developed sophisticated safeguards against these dangers, creating a graduated system of training that ensured each individual developed the wisdom and ethical foundation necessary to handle expanded capabilities responsibly. The organizational structure the Templars inherited from Solomon's tradition was unlike anything medieval Europe had ever seen. It combined elements that modern analysts would recognize as systematic psychology, comparative religion, practical science, and advanced organizational theory. But it did so within a framework that treated consciousness development as the central purpose around which everything else was organized. At the outer level, the order appeared to be whatever the surrounding culture expected it to be. In Solomon's time, it had presented itself as a group of court advisors and temple administrators. Among the Greeks, similar groups had operated as philosophical schools. In early Christian communities, they had functioned as monastic orders. The Templars were simply the latest manifestation of this adaptive strategy. But beneath these cultural adaptations, the core structure remained constant. New members were carefully screened for psychological stability and ethical development before being admitted to even basic training. Those who proved themselves capable of handling preliminary knowledge were gradually introduced to deeper levels of understanding, with each stage protected by oaths that ensured the tradition's survival even if individual members were compromised. The knowledge preserved within Solomon's order drew from every authentic spiritual tradition that had ever existed.
Egyptian mystery schools had contributed systematic methods for developing specific states of consciousness. Babylonian priests had preserved astronomical knowledge that revealed humanity's place in cosmic cycles spanning thousands of years. Persian magi had developed practices for working with subtle energies that modern science is only beginning to understand.
But Solomon's genius had been his synthesis of these diverse traditions into a coherent system that could be transmitted intact across generations. Instead of the fragmentary preservation that characterized most mystery schools, his order maintained complete methodologies that could reproduce the same results in any sincere practitioner, regardless of their cultural background. The Kabbalistic tradition that emerged within Judaism represented one public face of this preserved knowledge. The Tree of Life diagram that became central to Kabbalistic teaching was actually a simplified map of consciousness development derived from much more detailed systems preserved within Solomon's order. The Hebrew letters and numerical correspondences that Kabbalists studied were fragments of a sophisticated symbolic language that encoded practical instructions for advanced practitioners. But the Kabbalistic tradition, like all the public manifestations of Solomon's knowledge, had been deliberately simplified and partially obscured to protect it from misuse. The complete system could only be transmitted directly from teacher to student within the protected environment of the secret order itself. This explains why the Templars developed their own unique symbolic language that seemed to draw from multiple traditions simultaneously. Their famous seal, showing two knights sharing a single horse, wasn't just about poverty. It encoded a fundamental principle of consciousness development that appeared in Egyptian, Persian, and Hindu traditions under different symbolic forms. The unified field of awareness that transcends ordinary dualistic perception. The geometric patterns that appeared in Templar architecture weren't just decorative elements borrowed from Islamic sources. They were practical applications of sacred geometry principles that had been preserved within Solomon's tradition, designed to create specific effects on human consciousness through precise mathematical relationships embedded in physical structures. Even the Templars' controversial financial innovations reflected the application of ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges. The principles they used for managing complex international transactions had been developed by Solomon's order over centuries of practical experience with different economic systems. Their banking networks weren't just commercial enterprises, they were practical applications of organizational principles that had been tested across multiple civilizations. The integration of seemingly contradictory religious traditions within the Templar system becomes comprehensible when viewed from this perspective. Solomon's order had always recognized that authentic spiritual insight transcends the cultural forms through which it expresses itself. Whether expressed through Jewish, Christian, Islamic, or pagan symbolism, the underlying principles of consciousness development remained constant. This is why Templar initiation ceremonies incorporated elements that seemed to contradict Orthodox Christian doctrine. They weren't rejecting Christianity, they were placing it within the larger context of universal spiritual principles that predated and transcended any single religious tradition. The Christian framework provided necessary protection in medieval Europe, but the real substance came from the much older tradition they had inherited.
The astrological knowledge that permeated Templar practice wasn't superstition or occult speculation. It represented the preservation of astronomical observations that had been accumulated over thousands of years, revealing genuine correlations between celestial cycles and patterns of human development. Solomon's order had maintained these records not for fortune-telling,
but because they provided practical guidance for timing various stages of consciousness training. The mysterious head called Baphomet that the Templars were accused of worshipping wasn't an idol or demon. According to the ancient texts they had recovered, it was a symbolic representation of the integrated consciousness that emerged when an individual successfully balanced the masculine and feminine, active and receptive, rational and intuitive aspects of human awareness. The same principle that appeared in Egyptian, Hindu, and Taoist traditions under different names and images. The accusations of heresy that would eventually destroy the public manifestation of the Templars weren't entirely wrong. The order did possess knowledge that contradicted orthodox Christian doctrine. But this wasn't because they had been corrupted by demonic influences. It was because they had preserved a tradition of spiritual development that was broader and deeper than any single religious system could contain. The secret order that Solomon had established was designed to survive exactly this kind of persecution. The ancient texts contained detailed instructions for dissolving the visible organization while preserving the essential knowledge through hidden networks that could operate independently for centuries if necessary. When the suppression of 1307 finally came, the Templars were ready to implement survival strategies that had been developed and tested over 2 millennia. As we'll discover in the next chapter, this prepared dissolution allowed Solomon's tradition to influence the development of European civilization in ways that most historians have never recognized. The knowledge that had been preserved in secret for over 2,000 years was about to seed new forms of human organization that would eventually transform the entire world.
You're examining a Templar seal in 1250, turning the ancient bronze disc in your hands as candlelight catches the intricate engravings. At first glance, it appears to show the familiar red cross of the Templars. But as your eyes adjust to the subtle variations in depth and shadow, other patterns emerge, geometric forms that seem to shift and dance, revealing layers of meaning that no casual observer would ever notice. This isn't just decorative artistry. You're holding a three-dimensional textbook, a teaching tool that encodes multiple levels of information according to principles that Solomon's order had refined over millennia. Every line, every angle, every proportional relationship was calculated to transmit specific knowledge to those who possessed the keys to interpret the symbolic language. The famous six-pointed star, known as the Seal of Solomon, appears throughout Templar iconography, but never in isolation. It's always integrated with other symbols, crosses, crescents, geometric patterns, in combinations that seem random until you understand the underlying grammar of the ancient symbolic system. Each combination tells a specific story, preserves a particular teaching, or provides instructions for advanced practitioners. The relationship between Solomon's hexagram and the Templar cross isn't coincidental. Both symbols encode the same fundamental principle that appears in every authentic mystical tradition: the integration of opposing forces into a unified whole. The six-pointed star represents the intersection of upward and downward triangles, heaven and earth, masculine and feminine. The cross symbolizes the meeting point of horizontal and vertical planes, time and eternity, human and divine.
But these weren't just philosophical concepts to Solomon's order. They were practical instructions for consciousness development, describing specific states of awareness that could be systematically cultivated through disciplined practice. The symbols served as mnemonic devices, helping initiates remember complex training procedures long before written manuals could be safely preserved. You begin to understand why these symbols appeared with such consistency across different cultures and centuries. They weren't arbitrary inventions.
They were discoveries, maps of consciousness territory that remained constant regardless of who explored it. Solomon's Order had simply been the first to systematically catalog and preserve these discoveries in forms that could be transmitted across generations. The geometric patterns that became central to Masonic tradition represent one of the most sophisticated preservation systems ever developed. Every degree, every ritual, every symbolic tool in Masonic practice can be traced back to elements that Solomon's Order had systematically embedded within guild structures throughout medieval Europe. The operative Masons who built the great cathedrals weren't just craftsmen. They were carriers of encoded knowledge that had been entrusted to their professional organizations for safekeeping. The transition from operative to speculative Masonry that occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries wasn't random evolution. It was the activation of a preservation system that had been designed centuries earlier to ensure that Solomon's knowledge would survive the destruction of the Templars. When the time was right, when political and intellectual conditions could support the reemergence of the ancient tradition, the dormant elements would naturally reorganize themselves into a new form suitable for the contemporary world.
The rituals that modern Freemasons perform in their lodges aren't medieval inventions. They're carefully preserved fragments of the initiation procedures that Solomon's Order had developed over millennia, adapted to function within the protective framework of craft guild traditions. Every symbolic drama, every ceremonial action, every ritual tool preserves specific elements of the consciousness training methods that had once been taught in Solomon's Temple. The famous Masonic legend of Hiram Abiff, the master builder supposedly murdered for refusing to reveal the secrets of his craft, isn't just an allegorical teaching story. According to traditions preserved within certain Masonic degrees, it preserves the historical memory of how Solomon's knowledge was hidden when the original order faced suppression. The lost word that Masons seek to recover isn't just a symbolic concept. It represents the complete system of knowledge that was scattered and concealed when Solomon's Temple was destroyed. The architectural symbolism that permeates Masonic tradition reflects the same sacred geometry principles that governed the construction of Solomon's Temple. The specific proportions used in Masonic lodge rooms, the positioning of symbolic elements, even the movements performed during ritual work all follow mathematical relationships that were designed to create specific effects on human consciousness. But Masonry wasn't the only system that preserved elements of Solomon's tradition. The guild structures that maintained various crafts throughout medieval Europe had all been infiltrated by initiates who embedded fragments of the ancient knowledge within their professional practices. Alchemists preserved chemical procedures that were actually consciousness transformation techniques disguised as metallurgical experiments. Astrologers maintained astronomical observations that provided practical guidance for timing various stages of human development. The symbol systems used by these diverse preservation networks weren't random collections of images and ideas. They were components of a sophisticated encoding system that had been developed to ensure that knowledge could be preserved even if individual carriers were compromised. The same core teachings appeared in multiple forms across different traditions, providing redundant backup systems that guaranteed survival even through the most severe persecutions. The rose and cross symbolism that became central to Rosicrucian tradition represented another fragment of the Solomon system. The rose symbolized the blooming of consciousness that occurred when proper training methods were applied. The cross represented the framework of disciplined practice necessary to support that development. Together, they encoded instructions for the same consciousness transformation procedures that had been taught in Solomon's Temple.
The appearance of Rosicrucian manifestos in early 17th century Europe wasn't coincidental. It represented the activation of another preservation system that had been designed to reintroduce Solomon's knowledge when European civilization had developed sufficient intellectual sophistication to receive it safely. The mysterious Christian Rosenkreuz, described in these texts, wasn't a historical individual. He was a symbolic representation of the continuous tradition that had preserved ancient wisdom through the Dark Ages. The alchemical symbolism that permeated Renaissance art and literature wasn't just poetic metaphor. It was a functional code that transmitted practical instructions for consciousness development to those who possessed the interpretive keys. The famous alchemical goal of transmuting base metals into gold was actually a symbolic description of the consciousness transformation that occurred when an individual successfully completed the training procedures preserved within Solomon's tradition. The appearance of these symbols in the work of Leonardo da Vinci, Dürer, and other Renaissance masters wasn't coincidental. These artists had gained access to fragments of Solomon's knowledge through various preservation networks, and they embedded what they had learned within their publicly displayed works. The same information was preserved simultaneously through multiple channels, ensuring that even if some carriers were lost, the essential knowledge would survive. The symbolic language that united all these diverse preservation systems was far more sophisticated than modern scholarship has recognized. It functioned according to principles that modern information theory would recognize as advanced data compression and error correction techniques. The same core information could be encoded through visual symbols, architectural proportions, musical harmonies, mathematical relationships, and ritual procedures, providing multiple redundant channels for transmission. But perhaps most remarkably, the symbol system was designed to be self-activating. Individuals who encountered the encoded information, even without conscious understanding of its significance, would begin to experience subtle shifts in consciousness that naturally led them toward the preserved knowledge. The symbols themselves served as consciousness transformation tools, gradually preparing receptive individuals for deeper levels of understanding. This explains why exposure to genuine Solomonic symbolism has always had such powerful effects on sensitive individuals. The geometric patterns, proportional relationships, and harmonic frequencies embedded within these symbols weren't just meaningful, they were functional, designed to trigger specific developmental processes in human consciousness. As we'll discover in our final chapter, this symbolic activation system may be approaching a critical threshold in our current era. The widespread distribution of these ancient symbols through modern media, combined with the increasing number of individuals who are naturally developing expanded awareness, suggests that Solomon's long-term preservation strategy may be entering its final phase of activation.
You're standing in the Vatican secret archives in 2019, watching as Cardinal Giuseppe Bertello examines a recently discovered manuscript with barely concealed alarm. The document, found during renovations of a wall that hadn't been opened since the 14th century, contains detailed genealogies tracing papal bloodlines back through centuries of carefully orchestrated marriages and adoptions. But these aren't random family trees. They map connections to the same ancient lineages that once provided leadership for Solomon's secret order. This discovery represents the Vatican's worst fear made manifest, evidence that their institution has been influenced, perhaps even controlled, by the very tradition they've spent centuries trying to suppress. The implications are staggering, because if these genealogies are accurate, then the Catholic Church hasn't been the guardian of Christian orthodoxy. It's been an unwitting preservation system for knowledge that predates Christianity by over 1,000 years. The relationship between the Vatican and Solomon's tradition has always been more complex than simple opposition. While church authorities publicly condemned anything resembling the ancient mystery schools, they quietly incorporated many of their organizational principles and symbolic systems. The hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church mirrors the graduated initiation system that Solomon's order had perfected.
Even the Vatican's famous secrecy protocols follow patterns that can be traced back to the preservation strategies developed by ancient mystery schools. But this wasn't coincidental convergent evolution. According to documents that have only recently come to light, the early Christian church was systematically infiltrated by initiates of Solomon's tradition, who recognized that the new religion could serve as an ideal cover for preserving ancient knowledge. Instead of fighting Christianity, they embraced it, gradually shaping its development from within while maintaining their deeper allegiances to the older tradition. This infiltration strategy explains many of the mysteries that have always surrounded Catholic doctrine and practice: the emphasis on ritual and ceremony, the preservation of Latin as a sacred language, the elaborate symbolic systems that permeate church architecture. All reflect the influence of traditions that the Church officially rejected. The Vatican became a repository for Solomon's knowledge, without its leadership fully understanding what they were preserving. The suppression of the Templars in 1307 represented a moment when this hidden influence almost came to light. Pope Clement V's reluctant cooperation with King Philip IV's persecution wasn't just political calculation. It was panic at the realization that the Church had been harboring the very tradition it claimed to oppose. The Templars' obvious possession of non-Christian knowledge forced a choice between acknowledging the Church's hidden influences or destroying the evidence of those influences.
But the suppression failed in its ultimate objective. The Templars had prepared for exactly this eventuality, implementing preservation strategies that Solomon's order had developed over millennia of experience with persecution. The most important knowledge and many of the key personnel simply vanished, along with treasures that have never been recovered. Official records suggest they were destroyed, but the evidence points to a carefully orchestrated evacuation that relocated the tradition's essential elements beyond the reach of church authorities. The subsequent emergence of Freemasonry in Scotland and England wasn't coincidental. These regions provided ideal conditions for reconstituting Solomon's tradition under new organizational frameworks that could operate without direct challenge to church authority. The guild system that already existed in these areas offered perfect cover for the consciousness development work that had always been central to the ancient order. Modern Freemasonry preserves far more of Solomon's original system than most Masons realize. The degree structures, the symbolic tools, the ritual procedures, all follow patterns that can be traced directly back to the consciousness training methods developed in Solomon's temple. But most contemporary Masons have lost the interpretive keys that would unlock the practical applications of what they're preserving. This loss of functional understanding wasn't accidental. As Solomon's tradition spread through various preservation networks, it was deliberately fragmented to protect it from suppression. Different groups maintained different pieces of the complete system, ensuring that no single organization could be destroyed to eliminate the entire tradition. But this fragmentation also meant that few groups retained access to the complete methodology. The Royal Arch degree in Masonry preserves one of the most complete fragments of the original tradition. The ceremony explicitly recreates the discovery of Solomon's hidden vault, complete with the sacred name and the geometric principles that were central to the ancient consciousness training system. But even here, the practical applications have been lost, leaving only the symbolic framework that once supported advanced human development work. The influence of Solomon's tradition extends far beyond Masonic lodges. Every major intellectual and spiritual movement of the past several centuries bears traces of the ancient knowledge, often without recognizing its source. The Renaissance emphasis on individual development, the Enlightenment focus on rational inquiry, even the modern human potential movement, all reflect principles that Solomon's order had systematized thousands of years earlier. The emergence of modern psychology and consciousness research represents the latest phase in this process.
Techniques for expanding awareness that had been preserved within mystery school traditions are now being rediscovered and validated through scientific investigation. Carl Jung's work on archetypal symbolism, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, even contemporary neuroscience research on meditation and altered states, all parallel discoveries that Solomon's order had made and systematized millennia ago.
But this convergence also presents unprecedented dangers. The knowledge that Solomon's tradition had carefully protected through graduated initiation systems is now becoming available to anyone with internet access. Consciousness expansion techniques that once required years of preparation and ethical development can be downloaded as smartphone apps. The safeguards that had protected both individuals and society from the misuse of advanced human capabilities are being systematically dismantled. This may be why certain elements of Solomon's tradition have begun emerging from their traditional secrecy. The same preservation instincts that had kept the knowledge hidden during dangerous periods now recognize that the greatest threat may come from uncontrolled revelation rather than suppression. If advanced consciousness techniques are going to become widely available anyway, it may be better to provide proper context and guidance rather than allow completely unguided experimentation. The Vatican's recent openness to dialogue with other religious traditions, their acknowledgement of the value of contemplative practices, even their cautious acceptance of scientific research on consciousness, all may reflect recognition that the ancient synthesis Solomon's order had achieved between spiritual development and practical knowledge may be humanity's best hope for navigating the challenges ahead. But this reconciliation faces enormous obstacles. Too many institutional interests depend on maintaining the fragmented approach that has characterized human knowledge for centuries. Religious authorities who have built their power on claiming exclusive access to divine truth, academic institutions that have divided reality into competing specializations, political systems that depend on keeping populations divided and distracted, all would be threatened by the integrated approach that Solomon's tradition represents. The question that faces our current era is whether humanity has developed sufficient wisdom to handle the reunification of knowledge that Solomon's order has been working toward for 3 millennia. The technical capabilities that modern science has developed, combined with the consciousness expansion methods that ancient traditions preserved, could create possibilities for human flourishing that surpass anything in recorded history. But the same combination could also produce catastrophes that would make previous Dark Ages seem minor in comparison. The bloodlines that have carried Solomon's genetic heritage through the centuries still exist, though most of their bearers remain unaware of their inheritance. The institutional networks that have preserved fragments of the ancient knowledge continue to operate, though they rarely coordinate their activities. The symbolic systems that encode the essential teachings remain active, continuing to influence human development in ways that most people never recognize. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Solomon's preservation strategy is that it was designed to succeed regardless of whether anyone consciously guided its implementation. The knowledge was embedded so deeply within human culture, encoded through so many redundant channels, that it would naturally reassemble itself when conditions were appropriate. We may be witnessing the early stages of that reassembly process now. The final question isn't whether Solomon's legacy will emerge into full visibility. The momentum toward that emergence appears irreversible. The question is whether contemporary humanity will prove worthy of the trust that the ancient order placed in our species' potential for wisdom and growth. Because if we are, then the next chapter of human development may fulfill the highest hopes that Solomon embedded in his secret order 3,000 years ago.